If you found out that the bridge your family drives across every day was built on a lie, would you burn the world down to fix it? Or would you use that lie to buy justice for those the world has already forgotten? I am a criminal in the eyes of the law, a traitor in the eyes of my mentor, and a ghost in the eyes of the city. But I'd do it all again, just to see those luxury towers tremble. Truth isn't a gift, it's a weapon, and I finally learned how to aim it. Julian sat in the sterile, white-tiled break room of Sterling and Associates, the hum of the refrigerator sounding like a ticking bomb. His hands, usually steady enough to measure a millimeter of structural deviance, shook as he gripped a blueprint that shouldn't have existed. Across the table, the morning sun cut through the blinds like razor wire, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the evidence of a catastrophic failure. He wasn't just looking at a mistake. He was looking at a deliberate, calculated omission signed by the man he called a father. Arthur Sterling entered the room with the practiced grace of a man who owned the skyline, his smile warm but his eyes perpetually assessing. He placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, a gesture that used to signify mentorship, but now felt like a lead weight pressing into bone. Arthur spoke about the upcoming bridge inauguration as if it were a coronation, ignoring the sweat cooling on Julian's neck. The older man's voice was smooth, like polished marble covering a hollow foundation, and for the first time, Julian heard the cracks underneath. The inspection report for the Grandview Bridge sat between them, a silent witness to a crime that could kill hundreds if the wind hit the cables at the wrong angle. Arthur caught Julian's gaze, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, professional steel that brooked no dissent. He leaned in, his whisper smelling of expensive coffee and old secrets, reminding Julian that the firm's bankruptcy would leave 500 families homeless. To Arthur, a few centimeters of steel fatigue was a, quote, manageable risk compared to the total collapse of his legacy. Julian walked through the office that afternoon, the glass walls feeling like the perimeter of a cage he had helped build. Every employee he passed was a life that Arthur was using as a human shield against the truth of his own incompetence. The right thing was to call the authorities, but Julian knew the city's corruption ran deeper than the bridge's pilings. If he spoke, the bridge would close, the firm would die, and Arthur would retire to a private island while the workers starved. That night, Julian stood in the shadows of the East Side District, where the rain-slicked streets reflected the neon rot of a city that didn't care about its poor. He looked at the dilapidated housing projects, buildings that were literally shedding their skin while the elite poured billions into the Grandview Bridge. A jagged piece of masonry fell from a balcony, narrowly missing a child playing in the gutter, and Julian felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over him. He realized that the truth was only valuable if it was traded for something even more dangerous. The first letter he sent to Arthur wasn't an anonymous tip to the press. It was an itemized list of repairs needed for the East Side blocks. He used a burner phone to send a high-resolution photo of the bridge's compromised weld points directly to Arthur's private line during a gala. Julian watched from across the street as the great architect turned pale, his champagne glass trembling in a hand that had never known a day of honest labor. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the leverage Julian now held over a god. Arthur met him in a parking garage that smelled of damp concrete and desperation, his face twisted into a snarl of shock and betrayal. He called Julian an ungrateful snake, a boy he had plucked from obscurity, only to have him bite the hand that fed him. Julian didn't flinch. his voice coming out flat and clinical as he detailed the exact cost of the housing renovations. He told Arthur that for every day the bridge remained a secret, a new wing of the East Side projects would be rebuilt with the firm's discretionary funds. The atmosphere in the office became a heavy burden, making every morning a challenge. And Julian, he moved through each day like someone carrying two worlds at once, working as the dedicated associate while spending his nights reviewing invoices for the housing projects. He noticed Arthur watching him, quietly, carefully, a competitor sensing that his rival was growing more capable. And every time they interacted in public, Julian felt this weight settling over him, pressing a little harder each time. Arthur tried to buy his silence with a partnership offer, sliding a contract across the desk that would have made Julian a millionaire by 30. Julian didn't even look at the numbers. He simply added a clause for a new community center in the most neglected ward of the city. The older man's face turned a bruised shade of purple as he realized Julian couldn't be bought with traditional greed. He was being held hostage by a moral code he didn't understand, and that made Julian far more dangerous than a common thief. By the end of the month, the first crews arrived at the East Side projects, their trucks bearing the Sterling & Associates logo like a brand. The residents watched in shock as the elite firm began installing high-grade reinforcements and modern heating systems in buildings they had ignored for decades. Julian stood on a nearby rooftop, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the progress of his shadow war. He was saving lives in the slums by risking lives on the bridge, and the weight of the trade-off was starting to crush his spine. Sarah noticed Julian's intense focus on the television when the bridge was discussed, her heart tightening just a little as the room fell still around them. She discovered hidden files on his laptop, quiet little secrets tucked away, and she understood then that he was involved in unethical activities. She did not see a noble motive. She saw a man influencing the lives of everyone in the city. And with a soft, steady breath, Sarah asked Julian why he felt he could determine outcomes for others. The first crack in Julian's plan appeared when a junior architect noticed the massive drain on the firm's liquid assets and gently flagged it as embezzlement. Arthur couldn't explain the missing millions without admitting to the blackmail, and Julian couldn't justify the repairs without exposing the bridge. They were two men tied together at the ankles, standing on a tightrope over a pit of fire, each waiting for the other to blink. And in that fragile moment, Julian realized the reversal was complete. He was the victim of a system that forced him to become a villain just to do any good. Arthur called him into the boardroom one final time. The lights dimmed so that only their faces were visible in the stark glow of the city lights. He told Julian that the board was opening an internal investigation and that someone had to take the fall for the unauthorized housing projects. He offered Julian a choice: confess to the theft and go to prison as a disgraced accountant, or he would release the bridge flaws himself and blame Julian for the oversight. The mentor was finally ready to burn the student to save the cathedral. Julian looked out at the bridge, its lights twinkling like diamonds against the dark velvet of the river, beautiful and deadly. He knew that the moment he stepped out of that room, his life as he knew it was over, regardless of what he chose. He thought of the families in the East Side who finally had heat and safety. And then he thought of the families who would cross that bridge tomorrow morning. His voice was a brutal whisper when he finally spoke, telling Arthur to call the police because he wasn't finished with his work yet. The part ended with Julian walking toward the elevators, the sound of his footsteps echoing like a funeral march through the empty halls of power. It felt as though the walls were holding their breath, watching him go. He had enough evidence to take Arthur down, but doing so would mean admitting he let a dangerous bridge stay open for months just to win a social war. He was no longer a safety inspector. He was an architect of a different kind, building a legacy out of secrets and spite. Behind him, he heard Arthur picking up the phone, and Julian knew the first blow of the fallout was about to land. The handcuffs felt unexpectedly cold against Julian's wrists, a clinical contrast to the sweltering heat of the precinct's interrogation room. Across from him, a lead detective with eyes like flint laid out a trail of digital breadcrumbs that painted Julian as a disgruntled employee with a god complex. The public narrative was already being written by the firm's PR machine, a brilliant but unstable protege who siphoned millions to fund pet projects in the slums. Julian sat in the harsh, flickering overhead light, his expression a mask of stony indifference, while his pulse thrashed against his throat. Arthur Sterling didn't just throw Julian to the wolves. He curated the pack, ensuring every piece of evidence pointed toward financial desperation rather than structural salvation. During the initial hearing, the courtroom was a sea of high-contrast suits and judging stares, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and quiet condemnation. Julian watched from the defendant's table as his mentor testified with a trembling voice, playing the part of the heartbroken father figure betrayed by a greedy son. Every word Arthur spoke was a polished stone, sealing the door of Julian's cell before the trial had even truly begun. The media feeding frenzy was immediate, with headlines calling Julian the Robin Hood of the boardroom, but in a way that felt more like teasing than praise. News crews swarmed the East Side housing projects, turning the families Julian had saved into little props for a story about tainted charity. People who had finally found safety now gazed at their new windows and reinforced walls with a soft, uneasy worry, wondering if their comfort had been built on stolen blood. Julian watched it all unfold on a grainy prison monitor, the shadows of the bars stretching across his face like long, dark stripes, almost like a sad, pre-written obituary. Inside the firm, the fallout was a clinical purging of anyone who had ever stood in Julian's corner or questioned a blueprint. Desks were cleared, hard drives were wiped, and the structural flaws of the Grandview Bridge were buried under a mountain of certified secondary inspections that Arthur had bought and paid for. The office became a quiet, echoing place, almost like a dim little room where even the walls seemed to hold their breath. The only sound was the soft, steady scratching of pens signing non-disclosure agreements, trading silence for a sense of safety, thin as paper but clutched tightly all the same. Those who knew the truth kept their eyes low whenever they passed Julian's empty office, as if the air itself had turned heavy around them, an invisible fog made of their own cowardice, settling gently but unmistakably over everything. Sarah visited him once, her face pale behind the scratched plexiglass of the visiting center, her anger having cooled into a sharp, brittle disappointment. She told him that the man she loved wouldn't have used people as pawns, even for a noble cause, and that his secrets had turned their life into a crime scene. She didn't ask if he was okay. She asked if the bridge was really going to fall, her voice cracking with the terror of a citizen who no longer knew who to trust. When Julian remained silent to protect the leverage he still held, she stood up and walked away, leaving him alone in the humming silence of the booth. The moral high ground, Julian thought he occupied began to feel like a crumbling cliffside as he realized the bridge remained a ticking time bomb. Every morning in his cell, he listened for the sound of distant sirens, terrified that the structural fatigue he'd used as blackmail had finally reached its breaking point. He had traded the lives of commuters for the lives of the poor, a math problem where every variable was a human soul. The irony was a jagged blade in his gut. By trying to be a savior, he had become the very monster who decides whose life is worth more. Arthur visited the prison under the guise of legal consultation, his presence in the grimy room as jarring as a diamond in a gutter. He leaned over the table, his voice a low, defensive hiss, as he told Julian that the bridge was being reinforced in secret, one bolt at a time, to avoid a public panic. It was a lie Julian could see through instantly. The firm didn't have the liquid assets left to do the work properly because of the money Julian had diverted. They were both trapped in a spiral of escalating deceptions. Two ghosts haunting a structure that was destined to fail. Julian's lawyer, a cynical man who specialized in high-profile disasters, told him that a plea deal was his only hope of seeing the sun before he turned 50. The deal required Julian to sign a confession stating that the structural flaws were a fabrication he used to justify his embezzlement. If he signed, the bridge would remain a miracle of modern engineering in the public eye, and the firm would survive. If he refused, Arthur would ensure the trial dragged on until Julian was buried under a mountain of fabricated character flaws and forensic lies. The work site was a place of intense activity, unlike the routine tasks of the office. Julian stood near the equipment, observing people interact. While he had the ability to initiate widespread changes, he understood that the change he had made was not just about different methods, but about connecting those who needed support with those who had resources. As the trial date approached, Julian began to receive anonymous letters in the prison mail, smuggled notes from the East Side residents who knew what he'd done. They didn't call him a hero, they called him a desperate man. But they thanked him for the heat in their radiators and the locks on their doors. These scraps of paper were the only things that kept him from succumbing to the cold indifference of the system. They were the evidence of his right reasons, even if the world only saw his bad choices, and they fueled a new, dangerous determination. The night before his final testimony, a massive storm rolled over the city, the thunder sounding like the groan of stressed steel in Julian's ears. He sat on his bunk, the high-contrast moonlight through the window painting the walls in stark blacks and whites. He knew the bridge was swaying in that wind, the cables screaming under the weight of Arthur's ego and Julian's silence. He had to decide if he would keep the secret to protect the housing projects, or if he would burn his own legacy to ground to stop the cars from crossing. Arthur's final move was a cold, calculated betrayal. He leaked a story to the press claiming Julian had intentionally sabotaged the bridge blueprints to create the flaws for his blackmail. Now, the public didn't just see a thief. They saw a potential mass murderer who had played with their lives for a thrill. The anger in the city reached a boiling point, with protesters outside the jail demanding the maximum sentence for the architect of terror. Julian realized that the reversal was total. The victim of the firm's negligence was now the face of its greatest crime. Julian stood before the mirror in his cell, the clinical light highlighting the new lines of age and stress around his eyes. He realized that Arthur was banking on Julian's desire to be a good person to keep him quiet. If Julian spoke, he'd be admitting he was an accomplice to the bridge's danger. But Julian was done playing by the rules of men who built monuments to their own greed. He began to write a statement that wasn't a defense, but a confession that would tear the city's heart out, regardless of the cost to himself. The courtroom on the day of the verdict was a pressure cooker of shock and anticipation, the air almost trembling like a held breath beneath a stormy sky. In the very front row sat Arthur, his expression carved into a cold, smug sort of victory, certain he had finally buried the protégé he once claimed to guide. And then Julian stepped forward, not as a defendant, but as a man who had already made peace with whatever ending waited for him. He didn't look toward the judge, nor the cameras humming around him. Instead, he lifted his gaze and fixed it right on Arthur. And when he began to speak, it was with a raw, unshielded honesty that settled over the room like a hush, soft but impossible to ignore. Julian didn't talk about the money. He talked about the weight of a bridge and the weight of a conscience. He traced every weld, every bolt, every quiet little meeting in the shadows, gently brushing away the firm's shiny polish, until only the raw, gritty truth was left behind. He admitted to the blackmail, the theft, and the silence, never once trying to paint himself as a hero or a victim. And he told the audience, softly but clearly, that he had failed them, yet Arthur Sterling had sold them out long before Julian ever picked up a pen. The part ended with the judge banging the gavel as a riot of noise erupted in the gallery. The "what would you do?" debate finally spilling into the streets. Arthur's face was a mask of shattered glass, his legacy dissolving in real time as the police moved toward the front row. Julian stood in the center of the chaos, a man who had finally told the unspoken truth, knowing it would rebuild the East Side but destroy his own life. He was led away in chains, the shadow of the bridge looming over the city like a question no one was ready to answer. The sentencing was a cold, clinical affair, devoid of the theatrical outrage that had defined the trial. And there Julian stood before the bench, beneath those harsh fluorescent lights that made his skin look like gray parchment, while the judge delivered a verdict that felt so very much like a burial. He was handed a decade in a maximum security facility, a sentence meant to soothe the public that felt both saved and violated by his actions. As the guard stepped in, Julian didn't look for Sarah or search for a friendly face. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty chair where Arthur Sterling had once sat before his own arrest. The transition from the corporate high-rise to the concrete box was a descent into a world of brutal, unvarnished truth. In prison, there were no metaphors, only the clanging of iron doors and the suffocating weight of four walls that smelled of ammonia and old regrets. Julian's daily life became a sequence of gray moments, gray food, gray uniforms, and the gray light of a courtyard that felt like a bottomless pit. He was no longer the architect of silence. He was inmate 402, a man whose complex moral grandstanding had been reduced to a line item in a state ledger. Outside, the city he had tried to fix was tearing itself apart in the fallout of his confession. The Grandview Bridge was closed indefinitely, paralyzed by a massive forensic audit that cost the city millions and choked the veins of local commerce. Commuters who had once praised the skyline now cursed Julian's name as they sat in 3-hour detours, their gratitude for being saved eclipsed by the daily grind of the chaos he had caused. The debate in the comments sections and on street corners was polarizing. Was he a guardian angel with dirty hands, or a narcissist who had set the city on fire to feel important? Arthur Sterling's downfall was swifter and more spectacular, a high-contrast collapse played out on every news channel in the country. The great architect was stripped of his licenses, his awards, and his dignity, ending his days in a legal battle that drained his offshore accounts until there was nothing left but his name. Julian watched the coverage on the common room TV, seeing Arthur being led into a courthouse with a coat over his head to hide his shame. There was no joy in the sight, only a cold, hollow realization that they were both just different versions of the same structural failure. In the East Side, the housing project stood as a silent, sturdy testament to Julian's crimes, their new roofs holding firm against the winter snow. The residents held a small, private vigil for the man who had traded his freedom for their furnace repairs, but even they were divided on his legacy. Some saw the renovations as a miracle, while others felt like they were living inside a bribe, their safety bought with the potential lives of thousands on the bridge. Julian's good deed had left a permanent stain on the very people he had wanted to uplift, turning their homes into a landmark of controversy. Sarah never came back, her absence a locked door that Julian stopped trying to open in his mind. He received a final letter from her, a stark, confrontational note that didn't offer forgiveness or even closure. She told him that the right reasons are just the lies we tell ourselves when we're too afraid to be ordinary. She had moved to a different city, one where the bridges were safe and the people didn't play God with the infrastructure. Julian folded the paper into a tiny, sharp square and left it on the floor of his cell, a visual metaphor for a life he had dismantled with his own hands. Years passed in a blur of routine and the slow, grinding realization that the world had moved on without him. The bridge was eventually repaired and reopened, rebranded with a new name that gently scrubbed the sterling legacy from the city's map. Julian became a footnote in architectural textbooks, a tiny cautionary tale about the ethics of the whistleblower that students debated with cool, clinical detachment. He was a ghost now, softly haunting a city that had learned to live with the cracks he had exposed, his sacrifice drifting into memory, becoming a little trivia point rather than a revolution. On the day of his release, Julian stood at the prison gates with a single bag of belongings and a face that had forgotten how to smile. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged horizon of glass and steel that no longer felt like a masterpiece he could influence. He took a bus to the East Side, walking through the projects he had rebuilt with stolen money and shadow contracts. The buildings looked older now, weathered by time and the harsh reality of urban life, but they were still standing, their foundations as solid as the day the crews had left. He walked to the center of the Grandview Bridge, the wind whipping his thin coat against his frame as the cars rushed past him in a blur of indifference. He placed his hand on the cold steel of the railing, feeling the vibration of the traffic through his palm, a steady rhythmic pulse that signaled safety. He had spent his youth obsessing over the flaws in the steel, but standing there, he realized the flaw was never in the metal. It was in the hearts of men who thought they could balance the scales of justice with a secret and a lie. Julian looked down at the dark water below, the reflection of the city lights shimmering like shattered glass on the surface of the river. He was a man with no career, no family, and a reputation that would forever be a battlefield for strangers. Yet, as he watched a mother and child walk safely across the pedestrian path, a flicker of something that wasn't regret touched his eyes. He had become a villain to ensure they remained victims of nothing more than the ordinary world, and to him, that was a debt he was finally done paying. He turned away from the railing and began to walk toward the city, a shadow merging with the thousands of others on the sidewalk. He didn't need a monument or a thank you. He needed the silence that he had fought so hard to break. The story of the quiet whistleblower ended not with a bang, but with the soft sound of footsteps on a bridge that held firm. He disappeared into the crowd, an architect of a life that was now entirely his own, built on a foundation of brutal, unapologetic truth. If your survival depended on a lie, but your conscience demanded a crime to fix it, which would you choose? In the hush of that crossroads, where truth trembles like a lantern in the dark, Julian saved the forgotten at the cost of the innocent, and now we're left to wonder, was his sacrifice a quiet masterclass in justice, or the soft-spoken, ultimate act of betrayal?